You're just jealous, snapped Brent, tossing my compliance report onto the conference room table. These partnerships are worth 8 figures each, but I wouldn't expect someone like you to understand business at this level. I felt 20 pairs of eyes on me as the CEO's son continued his dismissal. Maple thinks these companies are on some restricted list. He made air quotes with his fingers. But what she really means is she's upset that I closed 3 major deals while she pushes papers in her little compliance corner. The entire executive team watched silently. No one spoke up, not even Theo, who had personally hired me 5 years ago to build the company's international compliance program from scratch. My dad signs my recommendations without question, Brent continued, his voice dripping with satisfaction. He never even reads the fine print. Face it, Maple, no one's going to believe you over me. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I walked to the projection screen and pulled up the most recent federal registry. 3 company names highlighted in alarming red: Daxton International, Fiorate Trading, and Kelston Resources. These aren't just restricted companies, I explained calmly. They're under active investigation for money laundering and sanctions violations. The paperwork you signed last week binds us legally to all 3. Brent yawned dramatically. Boring and irrelevant. If money transfers to any of these entities, we're looking at potential criminal charges. The fines start at 8 figures. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. At 26, Brent had been vice president for exactly 7 months, the exact time his father had been CEO. Everyone knew how he'd gotten the position. Listen, Maple, you've been here, 5 years, and you're still just a specialist. Meanwhile, I closed more revenue last quarter than you'll see in your lifetime. So, why don't you leave the big decisions to people who actually matter around here? Laughter rippled around the table. I gathered my papers and left without another word. Before I continue further with what happened next, I want to thank you for listening to my story. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. I'm always curious to know who's hearing these stories and where they reach. My name is Maple Winters. I'm 31, detail-oriented to a fault, and until last year, I was the international compliance specialist at a mid-sized financial services firm. I'm the person companies hire to keep them from accidentally breaking federal trade laws, the invisible guardrail that prevents ambitious executives from driving businesses off regulatory cliffs. I grew up in a small town where my mother ran the local library. Every afternoon after school, I'd sit behind the checkout desk, watching her meticulously organize information and help people find exactly what they needed. Details matter, Maple, she'd say. The right information at the right time can change everything. That lesson shaped my entire career. I graduated with dual degrees in international business and law, then spent 3 years at a regulatory agency before Theo recruited me. We're expanding globally, he told me during my interview. We need someone who can build safeguards that grow with us. For 5 years, I did exactly that. I created compliance systems, trained our international teams, and prevented countless potential violations. My work wasn't flashy, but it was essential. Theo understood that. The board understood that. Then Theo retired, and everything changed. The new CEO, Gregory, brought in his son Brent almost immediately. Despite having only 2 years of work experience at his uncle's company, Brent was named Vice President of International Partnerships, effectively putting him in charge of the very deals I was supposed to monitor. From day one, Brent made it clear he considered compliance an obstacle rather than a safeguard. Rules are for people who don't know how to win, he told me during our first meeting. My father didn't get to where he is by being cautious. For months, I watched as he sidestepped protocols, rushed approvals, and gradually excluded me from meetings. Experienced team members who raised concerns were reassigned or pushed out. New hires were all personal connections of the CEO or his son. I survived by becoming almost invisible, documenting everything but confronting nothing, until 3 days ago, when I received partnership documents requiring my sign-off. The contracts had already been executed with 3 companies I immediately recognized from the restricted registry. Brent had somehow bypassed the system alerts I'd designed specifically to prevent such partnerships. When I checked the digital records, I found he'd used his father's login credentials to override the warnings. That's what led to that disastrous meeting where Brent humiliated me in front of the executive team. I returned to my office afterward and sat staring at my computer, 5 years of work potentially undone by one arrogant man's decisions. The legal exposure was enormous. These weren't minor regulatory concerns. These were companies actively being investigated for criminal activity. I pulled up Gregory's calendar. He was traveling in Dubai until Thursday. By then, initial payments would have been processed. Evidence would be harder to trace. The damage would be done. I considered my options. I could email Gregory directly, but Brent was right about one thing. Blood loyalty ran deep. The CEO would likely delay acting until he returned, giving his son time to cover tracks or shift blame. I could take it to the board, but Gregory had appointed most of them. They'd defer to him out of courtesy, again creating dangerous delays. Or I could go directly to the regulatory authorities. The company had a whistleblower policy that theoretically protected employees who reported violations, but I'd seen how whistleblowers were treated in practice. They were legally protected, but professionally destroyed. I was still considering my options when Brent appeared in my doorway. "Look, I know you're upset," he said, his tone suddenly conciliatory. "But this is happening with or without your approval. These deals are too important." "Important enough to risk criminal charges?" I asked. "Don't be dramatic. My father's golf buddies include 2 former agency commissioners. If any problems come up, they'll be handled quietly." I felt sick. "That's not how this works." "That's exactly how it works at this level." He leaned forward. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to sign off on these partnerships by end of day. In return, I'll put you on the bonus structure for all 3 deals. We're talking potentially mid-6 figures over the next 2 years. You're asking me to knowingly approve illegal transactions. I'm offering you the opportunity to be smart instead of rigid." He checked his watch. "I have a lunch. Think about it. But remember, these partnerships are moving forward regardless. The only question is whether you benefit or become irrelevant." After he left, I sat motionless, his words echoing. Not just the bribe, which was explicitly illegal, but the casual certainty that rules didn't apply to him, that connections could override law, that I was ultimately powerless. I suddenly remembered something my mother told me years ago when a powerful family in our town tried to bully her over library policies. "There are 2 kinds of power in this world," she'd said. "The loud kind that everyone sees, and the quiet kind that works while no one's looking." I opened my desk drawer and removed a small notebook. My personal documentation of every questionable decision Brent had made since arriving. Dates, times, witnesses, copies of emails I'd forwarded to my private account. Turning to a fresh page, I began writing a very detailed plan. By 5 o'clock, I had made my decision. I wouldn't sign the approvals, but I wouldn't directly challenge Brent either. I would take a different path entirely. "Have you thought about my offer?" Brent asked, appearing at my door just before I left. "I have," I replied calmly. "And I can't sign off on these deals." His face hardened. "Then I'll have my father sign them when he returns. And we'll need to have a discussion about your future here." "I understand," I said quietly. "We all make our choices." "Yes, we do," he replied, mistaking my calm for resignation. "Some of us just make better ones." As I walked to my car, I felt strangely peaceful. Brent thought he'd won. He had no idea what was coming. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying Brent's smug expression, his absolute certainty that he was untouchable. I got up at 3 a.m. and made tea. My apartment felt too quiet, too small. Tomorrow, Brent would start processing payments to those restricted companies. Once money moved, our company would be legally entangled in their activities. The violations would compound hourly. By 4 a.m., I'd made my decision. I wouldn't just protect the company, I would ensure Brent faced the consequences of his actions. Not through confrontation, but through careful, methodical documentation. I spent the next 2 hours preparing. I organized my evidence, created timelines, and wrote a detailed report explaining exactly what had happened. I included screenshots of the partnership agreements, copies of the restricted registry listings, and notes from my conversation with Brent, including his attempt to bribe me. At 6:30 a.m., I showered, dressed carefully, and drove to a small breakfast place 20 minutes from my apartment. I ordered food I barely touched, connected to their public Wi-Fi, and used a secure browser to access the Federal Trade Enforcement Agency's anonymous reporting portal. I submitted my evidence precisely, explaining the violations in clear, specific language. I provided just enough information to trigger an investigation, but held back certain details only someone inside our company would know. This would protect me from being immediately identified as the source. By 7:45 a.m., I was driving to work as if it were any normal day. "Good morning, Maple," said Dana, our receptionist, as I walked through the lobby. "Everything okay? You look tired." "Just stayed up too late watching a show," I replied with a practiced smile. "Nothing coffee won't fix." The morning proceeded normally. I attended 2 meetings, reviewed compliance updates from our European office, and avoided the executive floor entirely. At lunch, I sat with the marketing team and discussed weekend plans as if I had no concerns beyond whether it might rain on Saturday. At 2:13 p.m., everything changed. My desk phone rang. It was Vince, from security. "Maple, could you come to the main entrance? There are some people here who need to speak with compliance." My heart raced, but I kept my voice steady. "Of course, I'll be right down." In the lobby stood 4 people in business attire. The woman who stepped forward introduced herself as Agent Kira Lawson from the Federal Trade Enforcement Division. "We're conducting an inquiry regarding potential prohibited business relationships," she said, her voice professionally neutral. "We need access to your international partnership records, specifically those involving Daxton International, Fureit Trading, and Kelston Resources." Dana's eyes widened. Vince looked confused. I maintained a careful expression of surprise and concern. "Of course," I said. "I can help with that. Let me call our legal team to assist." While we waited for legal, I explained my role to Agent Lawson. "I'm the compliance specialist for international partnerships. If there are questions about these companies, I should be involved in addressing them." Our general counsel, Ellis, arrived looking flustered. After a brief conversation with the agents, he turned to me. "Maple, can you pull the files they're requesting? And, where is Brent? These appear to be partnerships," he negotiated. "I believe he's in meetings all afternoon," I said, "but I can access the documentation." I led the group to our conference room and began retrieving the requested files. As I worked, Ellis stepped outside to call the CEO. I could see him through the glass wall, his expression growing increasingly distressed. Word spread quickly. Employees whispered in hallways. Executives emerged from offices, asking questions no one could answer. At 3:26 p.m., Brent finally appeared. He strutted into the conference room, confidence radiating from every pore. "I'm Brent Nelson, Vice President of International Partnerships," he announced. "I understand there are questions about some of our recent agreements." Agent Lawson stood. "Mr. Nelson, we're investigating potential violations of federal trade restrictions involving 3 companies with which your firm appears to have established business relationships." Brent's smile didn't waver, but I noticed a single bead of sweat forming at his temple. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said smoothly. "We have rigorous compliance processes." "Yes, we do," I interjected quietly. "That's why I flagged these partnerships yesterday. During our executive review." Brent's head snapped toward me, his eyes narrowing. Agent Lawson looked between us. "You raised concerns about these partnerships, Miss Winters." "I did," I confirmed. "These companies appear on the restricted registry. I presented this information during yesterday's meeting." "And what was the outcome of that discussion?" she asked. Before I could answer, Brent cut in. "We were still evaluating the situation. No final determinations were made." "That's not accurate," I said calmly. "You dismissed the concerns and stated the partnerships would proceed regardless." Ellis looked horrified. Brent's face flushed dark red. "Agent Lawson," I continued, "I have documentation showing these companies' restricted status. I also have copies of the partnership agreements signed last week by Mr. Nelson." "You're overstepping, Maple," Brent hissed. "I'm doing my job," I replied, meeting his gaze steadily, as I attempted to do yesterday. The investigation continued through the afternoon. Agents interviewed staff, collected documents, and secured electronic records. I answered every question truthfully, providing evidence of both the violations and my attempts to prevent them. At 6 p.m., my phone rang. It was Gregory Nelson, calling from Dubai. "What the hell is happening?" he demanded, his voice raw with anger. "I'm getting calls about federal agents in our offices. There's an investigation into partnerships with restricted companies," I explained. "The Trade Enforcement Division arrived this afternoon. How did they even know about these deals?" he asked. "I can't say for certain," I replied carefully. But someone must have reported the violations. Was it you? He asked directly. Sir, I raised concerns through proper channels first. I brought this directly to Brent's attention yesterday with the entire executive team present. Silence stretched through the phone line. And what did my son say? Gregory finally asked, his voice now deathly quiet. I repeated Brent's exact words from the meeting, including his comment about Gregory signing anything without reading it. Another long silence. I'll be on the next flight back, he said. Until then, full cooperation with the investigation. And Maple, don't leave the building. I want a complete briefing the moment I arrive. For the next 8 hours, the investigation continued. Most employees were sent home, but key staff remained. The agents established a temporary command center in our largest conference room, where they reviewed partnership documentation, financial records, and communication histories. Brent alternated between blustering confidence and hushed phone calls from empty offices. Every time we passed in the hallway, his glare intensified. At 10:37 p.m., Agent Lawson asked to speak with me privately. Miss Winters, we've reviewed your compliance records. They're impressively thorough. Thank you, I said. I take my responsibilities seriously. That's evident. She studied me carefully. Based on our investigation, it appears you were the only person who attempted to prevent these violations. I remained silent, waiting. We're exploring the possibility of reduced penalties for the company, given your documented opposition to these partnerships, but we'll need your continued cooperation. Of course, I replied. There's something else, she added. The partnerships themselves are problematic, but we've discovered evidence of additional violations. Unauthorized access to secure systems, falsified approvals, attempted bribes. My breath caught. She had found everything. I'll need your formal statement on these matters, she said, particularly regarding any offers made to you by Mr. Nelson. I nodded slowly. I'll provide whatever information you need. By midnight, the initial investigation concluded. The agents departed with dozens of files and digital records, leaving behind a shocked, skeletal staff and a shaken Brent, who now sat alone in his father's office, making call after call to lawyers. I gathered my things, preparing to finally go home. As I passed the CEO's office, Brent emerged, blocking my path. You did this, he whispered, his voice trembling with fury. Somehow, you did this. I met his gaze without flinching. You did this, Brent. I just didn't stop you. When my father gets back, your father called me directly, I interrupted. He knows everything, including what you said about him in yesterday's meeting. All color drained from his face. My dad will protect me, he insisted, but his voice had lost its certainty. Maybe, I acknowledged. That's his choice to make. As I walked to the elevator, I heard him call after me. You won't win this. Do you hear me, Maple? You're nothing here. I didn't respond. I didn't need to anymore. In the quiet of my car, exhaustion finally hit me. I'd done what needed to be done, not just for myself, but for everyone whose livelihoods depended on our company operating legally. The coming days would be difficult, but at least now the truth was exposed. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This isn't over. I didn't need to ask who it was from. Morning arrived after a fitful sleep. I dressed carefully, chose a bold red blouse instead of my usual neutral colors, and drove to work with a strange calm settling over me. The office was in chaos. News of the investigation had spread, and employees gathered in nervous clusters, sharing rumors and fears. I walked through them, nodding reassuringly where I could. Gregory Nelson had landed. His town car pulled up as I entered the building. He looked haggard, his usually perfect appearance rumpled from 20 hours of travel. Maple, he called, spotting me across the lobby. My office. Now, as we rode the elevator in silence, I prepared for what might come. Gregory was a businessman above all else. He would protect the company first, his reputation second, and his son third, though he likely wouldn't admit that order even to himself. What I didn't expect was the third person waiting in his office. Theo Riley, the former CEO and the man who had hired me 5 years ago, sat in one of the visitors' chairs. He looked exactly as I remembered. Silver hair, watchful eyes, calm demeanor. The sight of him made my heart leap. I hadn't seen him since his retirement party 7 months ago. Maple, Theo nodded, his expression unreadable. Gregory shut the door behind us. Sit, he commanded, pointing to the remaining chair. I sat, keeping my back straight, hands folded in my lap. I've been on planes for nearly a day, Gregory began, his voice hoarse, during which time our company has been swarmed by federal agents, our bank accounts have been temporarily frozen, and our stock has dropped 12% on rumors of criminal investigations. He leaned forward. Please explain to me how this happened. I took a deep breath. 3 companies on the federal restricted list were signed as partners by Brent last week. When I discovered this and presented evidence at the executive meeting, he dismissed the concerns and suggested the partnerships would continue regardless. And you went to the authorities, Gregory stated flatly. I followed proper reporting procedures for serious violations. You should have come to me first, he snapped. You were in Dubai, I pointed out. By the time you returned, millions would have transferred to these companies. The violations would have been significantly worse. She's right, Greg, Theo interjected quietly. Once money moved to those accounts, the company would have crossed from administrative violation to potential criminal conspiracy. Gregory shot him an irritated look. I didn't ask you to join this meeting to defend her. No, Theo agreed mildly. You asked me because the board called me at 3 a.m., asking if I knew anything about this mess. He leaned forward. They're worried, Greg. Very worried. Gregory rubbed his temples. The agency has indicated they might reduce penalties due to Maple's documented opposition to these deals, but we're still facing significant fines. Better than criminal charges, Theo noted. Gregory turned his attention back to me. There's also the matter of how the authorities knew exactly what to look for. The timing suggests someone provided very specific information. I met his gaze steadily. The company has a legal obligation to follow federal trade restrictions. When those restrictions are violated, there are consequences. Did you report us? He asked directly. I considered my answer carefully. I did what was necessary to protect the company from much more serious consequences. If you review my documentation, you'll see I attempted to address this internally first. Gregory's jaw tightened. Before he could respond, his assistant knocked and entered. Sir, the board has convened an emergency meeting. They're requesting your immediate presence. Mr. Riley's too. She hesitated. And Miss Winters. Gregory looked startled. They want Maple? Yes, sir. Specifically. The boardroom felt colder than usual. 8 people sat around the long table, their expressions grim. The chairperson, Valerie, gestured for us to take seats. We've been briefed on the situation, she began without preamble. This is potentially existential for our company. I understand the seriousness, Gregory assured her. We're cooperating fully with. That's not enough, Valerie interrupted. The agency called me personally. This morning, they've expanded their investigation to include all international partnerships from the past 6 months. Gregory paled. That's excessive. That's standard procedure when they find violations, Theo explained. They need to determine if this was an isolated incident or a pattern. We need to understand exactly what happened, Valerie said, turning to me. Miss Winters, the agents spoke highly of your compliance work. They indicated you tried to prevent these violations. I nodded. Yes. When I discovered the partnerships with restricted companies, I immediately raised concerns. To whom? To Brent Nelson during the executive meeting yesterday. The entire team was present. And the response? I hesitated, glancing at Gregory. Speak freely, Valerie instructed. We need the truth. Brent said the partnerships would proceed regardless of compliance concerns. When I warned of potential criminal liability, I paused. He what? Valerie pressed. He later offered me financial incentives to approve the partnerships despite their restricted status. A shocked murmur ran through the room. You're accusing my son of attempting to bribe you? Gregory asked incredulously. I'm stating what happened, I replied. There were no witnesses to that conversation, but I documented it immediately afterward. Gregory started to object, but Valerie raised her hand. Where is Brent now? She asked. In his office, Gregory replied. I told him to stay there until we sorted this out. Valerie nodded to her assistant, who left the room. Moments later, Brent was escorted in, looking defiant. Would someone please explain why federal agents are combing through my deals? He demanded. Before noticing the full room, he faltered slightly, then straightened. This is a misunderstanding. These partnerships are completely legitimate. They're with companies on the federal restricted list, Valerie stated. Minor technicalities, Brent dismissed. Nothing we can't handle with the right connections. I watched Gregory wince at his son's words. Did you sign these partnerships knowing they violated compliance regulations? Valerie asked. I signed them knowing they were excellent business opportunities, Brent replied smoothly. Any regulatory concerns can be addressed afterward. That's not how compliance works, Theo said quietly. Brent shot him an annoyed glance. With all due respect, Mr. Riley, your cautious approach is why our international growth stalled under your leadership. Theo raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. Did you attempt to influence Miss Winters to approve these partnerships despite their restricted status? Valerie continued. Brent's eyes flicked to me, then back to Valerie. I merely suggested she consider the bigger picture instead of rigid adherence to bureaucratic red tape. Did you offer her financial incentives? Brent hesitated just long enough. I discussed potential bonuses related to successful partnerships. Standard practice. Not when the partnerships are illegal, Valerie corrected. That would constitute a bribe. This is ridiculous, Brent scoffed. She's twisting my words because she resents my position. Miss Winters, Valerie turned to me. Do you have documentation of these conversations? I nodded and opened my laptop. I maintain detailed records of all compliance concerns, including dates, times, and verbatim quotes when possible. I pulled up my files. I also have copies of the original partnership agreements, showing they were signed after these companies appeared on the restricted registry. May I? Valerie asked, reaching for my laptop. I turned it toward her. She spent several minutes reviewing my documentation while the room remained silent. Finally, she looked up. These records are extremely thorough, she observed, including notes from your attempt to warn about these specific companies yesterday. Gregory leaned forward to see the screen. His expression darkened as he read. There's more, I said quietly. The system shows Brent used the CEO's login credentials to override compliance alerts about these companies. Gregory's head snapped up. What? I navigated to the system logs. Here, your account credentials were used to bypass the restricted company warnings. The timestamps match when Brent was in the office, but you were traveling. Gregory turned to his son, his face ashen. You used my login to override security measures? Brent shifted uncomfortably. I needed to move quickly on these deals. The approval process is too slow. The approval process exists to prevent exactly this situation, Gregory exploded. Dad, come on, Brent tried for a confident smile. You've always said rules are just guidelines for people who lack vision. I never said, Gregory stopped himself, suddenly aware of the board watching them. We'll discuss this privately. I'm afraid not, Valerie said firmly. This is now a board matter. She turned to me. Miss Winters, the agency speaks highly of your compliance work. They've indicated penalties might be reduced based on your documentation showing you attempted to prevent these violations. I built our compliance system to protect the company, I said simply. That's my job, and you've done it exceptionally well, Valerie replied. She looked around the table. We need to vote on immediate actions. What happened next unfolded with breathtaking speed. The board voted unanimously to suspend Brent, pending a full investigation. They appointed an emergency management committee to handle the agency's inquiries. And most surprisingly, they asked me to lead a complete review of all international partnerships. But I'm just a compliance specialist, I protested. Not anymore, Valerie stated. Effective immediately. You're our new Director of International Compliance and Ethics, reporting directly to the board. Brent's face contorted with rage. This is insane! She deliberately sabotaged me. You sabotaged yourself, Theo replied calmly. Maple simply documented it. Gregory sat stunned as his son was escorted from the room. When the board adjourned 2 hours later, he remained in his chair, staring blankly at the table. For what it's worth, I said quietly as I gathered my things. I did try to warn him. Gregory nodded slowly. I know. I read your notes. He looked up, his expression haunted. He really said I signed things without reading them? Yes. And he tried to bribe you? Yes. He closed his eyes briefly. I gave him everything too easily. Position, authority, access. I thought I was helping him. I chose my next words carefully. Sometimes the greatest help we can offer is letting people face the consequences of their actions. 3 weeks later, the investigation concluded. The agency imposed a significant but manageable fine, citing our extraordinary cooperation and pre-existing compliance efforts as mitigating factors. Brent was gone, not fired publicly, but quietly separated with a small settlement contingent upon signing extensive non-disclosure agreements. The board accepted Gregory's resignation the same day, though they allowed him to call it early retirement. And me? I moved into an actual office with windows. My team tripled in size, my salary doubled, but the real victory came 6 months later, when Theo called me. Maple, he said warmly, I've been asked to rejoin the board temporarily, to help stabilize things. My first recommendation was promoting you to Executive Vice President of Global Compliance and Ethics. The vote was unanimous. Including Gregory? I asked, surprised. Especially Gregory, Theo replied. He told me, she tried to protect the company even when no one would listen. That's the leadership we need. I often think about Brent's words that day in the conference room. You're just jealous. My dad will never believe you over his own son. He was wrong on both counts. I wasn't jealous. I was doing my job, and in the end, his father believed the evidence, exactly as he should have. Sometimes the most effective response to arrogance isn't a dramatic confrontation. It's simply creating a clear, undeniable record of the truth, and then letting that truth speak for itself. Thank you for staying with me through this story. It wasn't easy to share, but I hope it might help someone facing a similar situation. If you found value in this experience, please leave a like and subscribe for more stories about navigating challenging workplace situations. And I'd love to hear in the comments if you've ever had to stand your ground when no one else would listen. Remember, sometimes quiet documentation is more powerful than the loudest argument.